The blue was the color of a winter sky just before the snow falls, deep, flat, and devoid of light. The white wasn't bright. It was the color of unbleached muslin, dull and heavy under the yellow glow of the kerosene lamp. My mother had pieced that quilt together over 3 long winters. She told me so that morning, her rough palms smoothing the fabric across the foot of the bed, her thumb catching on the tiny, even stitches. I remember the weight of it when I pulled it up over my knees later that night. It didn't yield or drape like modern blankets. It pressed down on my legs like a heavy hand, pinning me against the straw mattress. And the smell. It was sharp cedar from the chest, mixed with something sweet and faint, dried lavender, but older, dusty, like something meant to preserve a memory that was already fading. The lamp on the side table was turned down low, the wick sending a thin coil of gray smoke up into the glass chimney. Outside, the world was draining itself of noise. I could hear the last of the wedding guests leaving, gravel crunching under iron-shod buggy wheels, the low, wet snort of a horse shifting its weight against the shafts. A buggy wheel creaked nearby, a long, dry shriek that cut through the October dark and died out as the road bent toward the highway. It was cold. Cold enough that when I stood near the small window, my breath formed a tiny circle of mist on the glass, vanishing almost as soon as it appeared over and over. I was 18 years old, and I was entirely alone. My wedding dress was new, the stiff, dark blue fabric still smelling faintly of the dry goods store in town where the bolt had been purchased. The straight pins my sister had used to secure the front pricking slightly against my collarbone every time I took a deep breath. The bed was too big. That was the thing that hit me first. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was just the sheer empty space of it. In my father's house, there were 2 beds for 6 children. We slept tangled together like puppies, a foot in your ribs, someone else's warm breath against the back of your neck. You always knew exactly where you ended and someone else began because the boundaries were forced upon you by the lack of room. But this bed, this wide square of white and blue, was completely empty. It was just for us, and he wasn't there yet. I didn't know if I was supposed to sit on the edge of the mattress, or stand by the dark window, or kneel on the bare floorboards and pray until the door opened. No one had ever told me the mechanics of waiting. So I just stood there, right next to the corner of that blue quilt, my hands folded tightly over my white apron, my fingers laced together so hard that my knuckles turned the exact color of the unbleached muslin. I was waiting for something I didn't have a single word for yet. He didn't come that night. The silence in the house grew thick, the kind of quiet that has a physical weight to it. I watched the shadow of the window frame move across the floorboards as the moon rose, a cold silver square that slid over my shoes and up the side of the washstand. He didn't come the next night either. It was the 3rd night before the iron latch finally clicked, a small, sharp sound that felt like an axe striking dry wood in winter. By then, something had already frozen hard inside me. I carried that waiting. That suspension between a childhood that was over and a life that hadn't begun. In the small of my back and the hollow of my throat for years before I ever understood what it had taken from me. Let's pause for a moment. My name is Rebecca, and this is Rebecca Amish Home. If these stories stay with you, if they settle into your mind or make you feel less alone, please subscribe. It costs nothing, but it allows me to keep sharing these truths. Tell me in the comments, did anyone actually prepare you for marriage, or were you handed silence and told it was enough? If you want to ensure these hidden voices continue to be heard, a super chat or becoming a member supports this work directly. It keeps the lamp lit here. Now, let's go back to that room and the silence that filled it long before my wedding night. The Amish don't talk about the body, not directly, not ever. It's as if the physical self is a foreign country we live in, but are forbidden from mapping. There was a word we used, rain, meaning clean or pure, and it got attached to everything about being a woman. Rain in your dress, your behavior, your eyes when the boys rode past the fields. Nobody sat me down and explained this. I just absorbed it the way you absorb the smell of wood smoke and damp wool in a farmhouse kitchen during a January thaw. You don't notice it while you're breathing it. It's simply the air. It's only when you step outside the community, when you cross the perimeter of those fields, that you realize it's caught in your hair, deep in your lungs, and you can never quite get it out. To understand why I was standing alone by that blue quilt, you have to understand the rule that wasn't written anywhere. It didn't need to be. It lived in the way my mother's face went completely smooth and still if I asked a question that drifted too close to the edge of things. It was a mask she put on, a holy indifference that told you, clearer than any shout, to stop right there. It lived in what happened to Sadie Yoder. Sadie was 2 years older than me, a girl with quick eyes and a laugh that always seemed to start a second before anyone else's. One afternoon during a quilting circle, she leaned over and asked the bishop's wife a question. I never knew the exact words. The room had simply gone instantly, freezing cold quiet. The only sound left was the dry scritch of a needle pulling through batting. Sadie spent the next year being looked at sideways at every church Sunday. Not with anger, but with a heavy, watchful pity. You learned from that. You learned without anyone ever having to teach you. That was the whole design of the silence. It protected itself by making the alternative unimaginable. Even my older sister, Ruth, who was usually so sharp and practical, couldn't cross that invisible line. When she was 22 and I was 15, she'd be paring apples by the stove, the red skins curling over her thumb, and she'd start a sentence with, "When you're married, Rebecca." Her voice would be light. But then her words would just trail off into nothing. She'd stop, look down at her hands or the blade of the knife, and change the subject to the weather or the garden. I used to think she was just being modest, the way the church praised. I understand now that she didn't have the words either. None of us did. We were all carrying the same empty cup, and nobody had ever told us it was supposed to hold water. I almost asked her once, maybe 6 months before my own wedding, what I should expect when the lamp went out. I got as far as opening my mouth, the air catching in my throat. Ruth looked at me, and for a second her eyes held something I now recognize as a deep, helpless sorrow. She just reached out, touched my wrist with her cold hand, and said, "You'll be fine, Rebecca." That was all. And I believed her, because when you are drowning in dry land, you believe whatever hand is offered. Then there was Elias. He was 23 years old, the youngest son of a farming family 3 districts over. He had these remarkably quiet hands. That's what I noticed first about him when our families were introduced in his father's barn. He didn't wave them around or hook his thumbs into his suspenders the way some of the younger men did when they were nervous. He just held them straight down at his sides, perfectly still, like he was carrying something fragile and was being deeply careful with himself. We'd had maybe a dozen supervised conversations before the wedding was formally arranged. A few slow walks down the dirt lane after Sunday's singing, the horses stamping in the distance. One noon meal at his parents' house, where his mother kept refilling my coffee cup before I could even finish the top half, her eyes darting between us as if searching for a spark. In all those conversations, Elias never said anything unkind. He never said anything careless. Once, while we were walking past a field of old corn stubble, he asked me what my favorite time of year was. When I said early spring, when the mud just begins to dry and the crows come back, he nodded slowly, looking at the ground, like I'd just handed him an important secret. I think I loved him then. I'm still not sure I knew what love was. We weren't given a vocabulary for that either, but I trusted him. He felt safe, like a quiet room. The wedding was on a Thursday. My mother had baked bread that morning, the kitchen thick with the warm, sour smell of yeast and wood ash. It was her regular baking day, wedding or no wedding. The rhythm of the house couldn't be stopped for a girl's transition. The smell of that fresh crust was still tangled in my hair when I stood in my stiff dress in front of the bishop. The ceremony lasted for hours. The wooden bench pressed hard against my back, and my feet went completely numb inside my black leather shoes until I couldn't feel the floor beneath me. Afterward, the house was filled with food and singing, the kind of heavy, collective warmth that happens when the community gets loud. It's a particular kind of loud, not rowdy, but a dense wall of voices that feels like relief. People kept touching my arm, the older women especially. They'd give me these little, lingering squeezes on the shoulder. These small, knowing smiles that I kept trying to read like a map. I thought they were trying to tell me something secret, something essential about what was coming. I think now they were just remembering their own Thursdays, and the silence they'd been left with. The room they'd set up for us was at the very back of his parents' house, past the pantry. His family had agreed to sleep in the front rooms for the first week while we settled in. That was the custom, a small bubble of privacy carved out of a crowded life. Someone had placed a small tallow candle on the windowsill. It was already lit when I walked in, its flame flickering weakly against the dark glass, already burning down to the metal holder. I sat on the very edge of the bed, the starch in my dark blue dress crackling in the quiet. I listened to the house slowly dying down. I heard the voices through the plaster wall. Someone laughing, a low, muffled laugh, then the creak of a floorboard, then nothing. The candle threw long, distorted shadows of the window frame onto the white ceiling, and I just sat there and watched them stretch and twist as the wick drowned in its own wax. An hour passed, maybe 2, and then I heard his footsteps in the hallway. They were heavy, unmistakable. They stopped right outside the heavy oak door. I held my breath, my heart knocking so hard against my ribs. I thought it would tear the pins from my apron. I waited for the iron latch to lift, but nothing happened. There was just a long, suspended silence on the other side of the wood. And then, after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps turned and moved slowly back down the hall, away from me. I sat there until the candle guttered out completely, leaving the room smelling of burnt fat. Then I lay down on top of my mother's blue and white quilt, still in my wedding dress, my shoes still on, and I stared into the blackness until the sky turned gray. The second night was exactly the same. The house went quiet, the candle burned down, and his footsteps came to the door. I know he was there. I'd been listening for the specific creak of the floorboard near the linen chest since sundown. He stopped. He stood there for 3 long minutes. And then he left. I didn't cry. I want to be very clear about that, because people who didn't grow up in that silence always assume there must have been tears. There weren't. Tears require a sense that something unfair is happening to you, but I didn't have that. I just lay there with my hands flat against the cold fabric of the quilt, and the dark thoughts began to grow. I thought, something is wrong with me. I thought it was my fault. I went through every one of those 12 supervised conversations we'd had, turning over every sentence like a stone, looking for the mistake. Did I say something wrong about the spring? Did I look at him the wrong way when his mother poured the coffee? I pressed my tongue against the roof of my mouth, pressing so hard it ached, just so I could feel the steady, terrifying thump of my own pulse in the dark. I lay there in that rigid dress for the second night in a row, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the morning light to rescue me from my own mind. On the third night, the door finally opened. The iron latch clinked, and the door swung wide. Elias stood in the frame, the yellow light from the hallway oil lamp hitting him from behind, throwing his face into complete shadow. He looked. I don't know how else to say it. He looked like a boy who had been handed a heavy tool he'd never seen before and had been ordered to fix something broken without showing his fear. He hadn't taken off his vest or his hat. He just stood there, his left hand reaching up to pull at the cuff of his sleeve. This tiny, rhythmic, repeated motion, tugging at the threads over and over until the cloth was white under his thumb. I sat up on the edge of the mattress, my rumpled dress clinging to my skin. We looked at each other across that small distance, the silence between us so heavy it felt like a third person in the room. He cleared his throat, his shoulders dropping just an inch. He looked at the floor near my shoes and said, "I'm sorry it took me so long." Then he stepped inside, reached back, and clicked the door shut behind him. What followed that third night wasn't a sudden awakening. It was just a deeper kind of quiet. Neither of us knew what we were doing. We had been handed a life event that required a language we hadn't been taught, and we walked into it the way you walk into a cellar when the lantern goes out. Hands pressed flat against the dark, hoping we wouldn't strike something sharp. Elias was gentle with me. I need you to understand that. He was gentle the way a boy is gentle when he handles an injured bird, and is terrified his own fingers will crush it. But gentleness doesn't fill an empty space. It doesn't replace knowledge. When his hands shook against my skin, it did something strange to me. It made me feel less alone and entirely more terrified at the exact same time. I wanted to pull away and crawl closer all at once. My body felt like a borrowed coat that didn't fit my shoulders. By the time our first winter came on, locking the fields in gray ice, I had built a whole system inside myself just to manage. I learned to be somewhere else during the moments that felt wrong. It wasn't a sudden flight. I would just float slowly up to the plaster corner of the ceiling and watch the two figures on the bed from far away, patient and perfectly still, until the lamp was extinguished. I learned to read the shifting of the evening light against the wood-paneled walls. When the shadows reached the lip of the washstand, I'd start preparing myself the way my father prepared for a blizzard. I developed little habits. I would trace a small, invisible oval with my thumbnail on the back of my left hand, over and over, pressing until the skin went white and then red. It gave me an anchor. It gave me one small square of my own skin to hold on to. At the time, I didn't think this was sad. I thought it was what being a wife meant. I thought the dissociation, the cold numbness, was the great secret all the older women had been keeping from us while they smiled over their quilting frames. The first person who nearly cracked that shell was Hannah. It was a Tuesday in late February, and the snow was driving sideways against the window pane, blurring the boundary between the road and the ditches. The wood stove in the corner was crammed with hickory, making the air in the room thick and sleepy. We were working on a log cabin quilt, our fingers moving in the small rhythm of the needles. Hannah was 10 years older than me, a woman with gray eyes that always seemed to look at things a second longer than anyone else. She leaned over her square of fabric, her shoulder brushing mine, and asked in a voice that didn't travel past our stools, "How are you settling in, Rebecca?" I opened my mouth. For a split second, the oval on the back of my hand burned. I wanted to tell her about the 3 days of waiting, about the ceiling corner, about the heavy blue quilt that felt like lead. But I looked up and saw the rest of the women down the table, their heads bowed, their needles rising and falling in perfect unison. The silence in that room was like water in a well. If you dropped a stone, everyone would hear the splash. I swallowed the taste of copper and said, "Fine, thank you, Hannah. The house stays warm." Hannah didn't look angry. She didn't even look disappointed. She just gave a slow, heavy nod and went back to her stitching. But as she pulled her thread taut, she looked at the knot she was tying and said very softly, "A tight fence keeps the wolves out, Rebecca, but it starves the sheep inside if the grass runs hollow." That single sentence stayed in my ear for years. It was the truest thing anyone had ever said to me, yet it was wrapped in the very language that kept us blind. The fence wasn't built out of malice. Our people built it out of a fierce, desperate love to keep us pure, to keep us sane. They truly believed that by denying us the words for our own bodies, they were protecting our souls. But the price of that protection was paid in a currency no one talked about. It was paid in the slow, systematic erasure of our own instincts. You saw what happened to those who tried to climb the fence. In our 3rd year, a young woman named Miriam left her husband's farm. She didn't run to the English world. She simply walked back down her father's lane with her small cedar chest and sat on the porch. The community didn't shout at her. The bishop didn't cast her out with fury. Instead, they surrounded her with a quiet, suffocating kindness. The older women visited her with jars of preserved peaches. The deacon spoke to her father in low, encouraging tones by the well. They firmly, lovingly redirected her back to her duty, back to her husband, and back into the dark. When Miriam returned to the quilting circle 6 months later, her hands moved with the same steady precision as before. But the light behind her eyes had been put out. She looked like someone who had knocked hard on a heavy door, only to find that the room on the other side was completely empty. I watched her from across the table, and instead of speaking, I tucked myself smaller. I pressed my thumbnail deeper into the back of my hand and told myself that my survival depended on my silence. From the height of the years I've lived since then, I can see the real tragedy of that room. It wasn't just my body that was stolen from me. It was Elias's life too. He was just as much a victim of that holy silence as I was. The boys weren't given the secret looks or the quiet warnings at the edge of the gardens. They were given nothing at all. He entered that room with the burden of being a man, with the expectation that he should lead, but without a single tool to understand the woman sitting on the edge of his bed. We were two children left in the woods with a map written in a language neither of us could read, failing each other in the dark, and believing all the while that the failure belonged entirely to us. 4 years into my marriage with Elias, I still didn't have a single word for what was missing. I just knew the exact shape of the cold space where it should have been. And then I left. I am compressing long, heavy years into a few sentences here. There is so much more to the story of that crossing, and I will tell it to you properly another time. But I left, and I ended up in a world that had names for every single thing I had never been able to voice. I remember the specific moment the shift happened. I was sitting in an English clinic waiting room. The blue plastic chair had a long, jagged crack running up the left armrest, and I kept catching the loose thread of my coat sleeve on it, pulling it taut over and over. There was a small, faded pamphlet sitting in a plastic holder on the wall. A medical pamphlet. I reached out and picked it up simply because I needed something to do with my hands to keep them from shaking. And there, on the inside page, was a diagram. A simple line drawing of a woman's body. Next to the drawing there were words, clinical words, plain words, ordinary words that carried no shame. They were words I had never once heard spoken in any room I had grown up in. Something happened in my chest right then that I can only describe as a heavy fist unclenching, very slowly, after a lifetime of holding its breath. I sat in that plastic chair, and I read that small pamphlet 3 times from start to finish. By the 3rd time, the paper was crumpled under my fingers, my hands were trembling, and I wasn't sure if I was going to cry or laugh, or just sit perfectly still in that room forever. I wasn't angry. I want to be entirely precise about that, because people always expect fury when I tell this part of my life. I wasn't angry at all. I was just sad. Devastatingly sad. It was the kind of deep, wet sorrow that sits in the very bottom of your stomach like lead, because I kept thinking about that 18-year-old girl in the room with the blue quilt. I saw her standing there with her hands folded tightly over her white apron, waiting in the dark for something she couldn't even name. I thought about everything she didn't know, and everything nobody had ever thought to tell her, and I thought about how entirely different it might have been. How different it might have been for her, and for Elias both. Because he was just as lost in that room as I was. He had been failed by the exact same silence, and neither of us knew we were failing each other, because the failure itself had never been made visible to us. That's the true danger of a systemic silence. It doesn't feel like harm while it's happening to you. It just feels like normal. It feels like water. You don't notice you've been drowning in it until you finally surface and realize you've never actually taken a full breath of clean air. What I grieved most as the years passed wasn't the event itself. I need to say that carefully because it matters. What I grieved was the possibility. I grieved the version of that wedding night that could have existed, that should have existed, where 2 young people walked into a new life together with enough knowledge to treat one another gently. A world where they could understand what the other person needed, where they could ask and be asked and actually answer without fear. That version was stolen from us, not by Elias and not by my mother, but by a system that had decided generations ago that total silence was the only path to holiness. I tried to explain this once to a woman I worked with years after leaving the community. She was kind and she tried to listen, but I could see the blankness on her face. She didn't have the framework to hold it. She kept shaking her head and saying how awful it sounded, but she was hearing an isolated incident. One bad night. A simple breakdown of communication between a husband and a wife. I couldn't find the words to show her that it wasn't just one night. It was every single night for every young girl, built right into the very timber of how we learn to exist in our own skin. I walked out to my car afterward and just sat there in the dark for an hour without starting the engine. I felt the particular freezing loneliness of being suspended between two entirely different worlds, too far from the old one to ever go back, yet too foreign to this new one to ever fully arrive. I don't know if that loneliness ever fully goes away. But as time passes, you learn to carry the weight of it differently. Because here is what I refuse to let myself forget. The sound of the horses at dawn. That specific sound of iron hooves striking the cold, frozen ground, the soft, wet blow of their breath in the gray mist, the creak of a leather harness shifting as the buggy turns. There is nothing else in the world that sounds like that. Or the smell of fresh bread coming out of a wood-fired oven. Not a modern stove, it's never the same, and I've spent years trying to replicate that crust and failing every time. And my grandmother's hands when she was praying during the long church services. She had these wide, rough, calloused hands from decades of pulling beets and scrubbing pine floors, and when she prayed, she held them in her lap, loosely cupped and turned upward toward the ceiling. I used to watch them when I was small and think they looked like they were holding something invisible, something holy that I couldn't see yet. I am homesick for a place that hurt me. I have said that sentence to myself so many times that the edges of it have worn completely smooth. Both things are true. The beauty of that life was real. The harm of that life was real. They lived under the exact same roof, and I am who I am today because of both. If you grew up somewhere where your own body was kept from you like something dangerous, I see you. If you were handed an empty cup of silence where knowledge should have been, and you spent years thinking the confusion, the fault, and the brokenness were yours alone, I see you. If you are still inside a community that loves you and limits you at the exact same time, and you don't know how to hold both of those truths without breaking apart, I see you. If you left and you are grieving a loss you can never fully explain to the people standing around you now, I see you. I want to turn this over to you now. Leave me a comment below and pour out whatever is sitting heavily in your soul today. Was there a specific moment in this story that found you in the dark? Tell me what you felt, and let's talk face to face in the comments. There is still so much more I haven't said yet. Stories I haven't been brave enough to bring into the light, but I am getting closer every day. Stay with me here at Rebecca Amish Home. Subscribe if you haven't yet, because the next story is already waiting to be told. And to my members in Super Chat family, you are the reason the lamp stays lit and the next voice gets heard. If you want to walk through that door with me, it is always open. Remember this always before you sleep tonight. Your body was never the problem. It never, ever was.